The final thing to look at in this section on the activity lifecycle is to understand there is also a fragment lifecycle. So over in Google Chrome, I'm going to do a quick search for Android fragment lifecycle to try and find the official documentation. And I can see at the top there, fragment lifecycle from the developer.android guide. So clicking into this, we've already done a deep dive into the activity lifecycle, looking at the 6 methods: on create, on destroy, on start, on stop, on resume, and on pause, looking at them in pairs. Well, as well as the activity having a lifecycle, as you can see from the documentation, each fragment instance has its own lifecycle. When a user navigates and interacts with your app, your fragments transition through various states in their lifecycle as they are added, removed, and enter or exit the screen. Now, there's quite a lot of information in this fragment lifecycle documentation. We're just going to scroll down to the diagram, and we can see we have a quick indicator of this fragment lifecycle. And at first glance, we can see on create, on destroy, we see on start and on stop, on resume and on pause. So we have the same lifecycle methods that exist in an activity, and there are 1 or 2 extra ones: on create view and on view created, on view state restored, and then on destroy view. Now, I'm not going to walk through every single one of these lifecycle methods again. Actually, when it comes to fragments, there's only 2 or 3 that you're likely to use on a regular basis. And these are on create view, on view created, understanding where to use these, what the difference is, and what you should and shouldn't do with these 2 methods. So we'll look at this in just a moment. And there's also a couple of other methods that aren't included in this diagram. And these are called on attach and on detach. Now, if we look a little closer in the documentation under fragment created, we can see here, when your fragment reaches the created state, it has been added to a fragment manager, and the on attach method has already been called. So for the purpose of this documentation, the Android developers don't consider on attach, or conversely, the other method on detach. They don't consider those to be lifecycle methods. Personally, as an Android developer, I kind of do, even if it doesn't appear in this diagram. So the 4 things we're going to look at in this tutorial are on create view, on view created, and then on attach, which I'll just open a new tab. And actually, if we scroll up, we'll see on attach and on detach talked about together. So here we can see on attach when a fragment is added to a fragment manager, and indeed on detach when a fragment has been removed from the fragment manager and is detached from its host activity. So on create view, on view created, and then on attach and on detach we're going to look at in practice in just a moment. Now you may be thinking, why am I not going to go into any detail on the other methods, like on create, on start, on resume? Well, the first reason is the circumstances under which these are called on create, on start, on resume are very similar, if not the same, as is the case for the activities versions of on create, on start. And you can go ahead and read in the documentation to see the circumstances where these are called, okay? And the reality is, as an Android engineer who's worked on dozens of projects, I tend not to use the on create, on start, on resume methods, the typical activity lifecycle methods, in the fragments. Usually, for my needs case, I handle what I need to do with the user coming in and out of the app at the activity level. And so I find myself not needing to do very much in the fragment equivalents, okay? It is this on create view, where we actually tell the system what view to show on the screen, and then in on view created, where we now have our inflated view and we can start working with it. This is where most of the action happens in fragments. The on attach and on detach methods, which we will also cover, this is a method that can be used to communicate from the fragment to the host activity. So rather than overwhelm you with a dozen lifecycle methods in a fragment, I'm going to talk about the few that are actually used on a day-to-day basis in most Android projects. So we'll head first into the documentation for on create view. So if we scroll down to where it says fragment created and view initialized, we can see there's a reference to this on create view. So we can override on create view, as we've done already in the previous section, and we can programmatically inflate or create the fragment's view. So if I right click and open that in a new tab and head over to it, we can see on create view, and we can see some of the notes for this method. It's called between on create and on view created. So it's key that you understand it is called before on view created. And this is called to have the fragment instantiate its user interface view. So typically we would inflate some sort of view and then return that in this method. It expects a type of view to be returned. And that is then what will be shown on the screen. It will create the view that we provide. A key reason why I'm showing you this documentation though is this line here. It is recommended to only inflate the layout in this method and move any logic that operates on the return view to on view created. Now this is crucial. If you try and do too much in on create view, you inflate the view and then you start doing things with that view like setting click listeners or setting text values or the like, you're going to run into problems and indeed your app might crash at runtime. So all we should be doing in the on create view method is pretty much setting up our view binding, inflating our layout and returning the view. Anything else should be done in on view created. And I can go ahead and click this to jump down to the on view created method. We can see it is called immediately after on create view has returned. So once we've created the view and given it to the fragment, we then go into the on view created method. And this method, on view created, is where you should be doing all of your view setup in a fragment. Not in on create. We pretty much don't even use on create in a fragment. Not in on create view, this one. That's where we just inflate the view and give it to the fragment. We return it. On view created, that all of your screen setup should be done. So please remember that. We'll be doing this in practice in just a moment. So the final thing I mentioned was this on attach and indeed the on detach. If I just click over to the tab where I opened that. So you can see on attach, this is called when a fragment is first attached to its context. It happens before on create. On create will be called after this. So when we use the fragment manager, or the support fragment manager, as you're going to see in a moment, when we use that to add the fragment, well, that fragment will attach to the parent, which will be an activity. So this context parameter will actually be an activity. And this is one way you can go about communicating from the fragment to its parent activity. It's not necessarily the best way, but it does give you the opportunity to take the context object, which will be the activity, and then you can call methods on that activity. It's quite an old-fashioned, but still valid way of communicating from fragment to activity. And then the opposite method to this would be on detach. If I just find that, Control F, on detach, and I click it from the menu on the side, and this is called when the fragment is no longer attached to its activity, and it's called after on destroy has happened. And typically what people would do in this use case is they would use on attach to grab a reference to the activity, they would take the context and save it as a variable, and then what they would do is in on detach, they would clear that variable, set that variable to null, so you're not calling methods on an activity that the fragment isn't even attached to. Okay? So those are the 4 methods that matter. On create view and on view created are the most important, and we will take a very quick look at the on attach and on detach methods, as this is one way that you can use to communicate from your fragment back to your activity. So let's head over to Android Studio now and have a play with all of these methods and put the concepts into practice. We'll look now at some of those fragment lifecycle methods in practice, when they're called and what sort of things you can do with them. Back now in our Activity Lifecycle Playground app, we are going to need a new fragment and a fragment container, and then we'll need to set up the showing of the new fragment somewhere in this main activity. One of the first things we're going to do actually is remove the unused lifecycle methods. We've covered the concepts there, but now these are just unused overrides. You can see with the grey text for override fun, these are unused. So we'll go ahead and delete all of those. So we've just got a few things going on in our main activity now. And now we'll head over to our activity_main layout file. And the first thing we'll need is a place to put our new fragment that we're about to make. And if you remember the fragment section just before this one, it is a fragment container view, which is the best practice widget to use to put a fragment into. So you can go ahead and type fragment container view and autocomplete. And we'll put this underneath our buttons with like a fixed height. So what we'll do is we'll make the width, I don't know, 300 dp, and the height will make 400 dp, just like that. And we'll say top to the bottom of the exit button. And we can close that container. And we're also going to need to give it horizontal constraints. So we'll do start to the start of the parent, end to the end of the parent, and that should center it. And we'll go ahead and give this an ID. So the ID can be our fragment container. And you'll notice that we appear to be getting an error in this version of Android Studio saying unknown fragments. And what this is saying is we've got a fragment container view, but for the design preview on the right, it doesn't really know what layout file, what fragment to show in the design preview. So to actually fix this and get our design preview to work, we would actually need some sort of layout. So that's fine. The next thing we can do is head over and make a new fragment layout. So I'm going to close the problems tab. And then in the resource folder layout, we can right click and make a new layout file. And this can be called our just fragment test for our test fragment. And for now, we'll just go ahead and file. This can be called. So I'm going to close the problems tab. And then in the resource folder, layout, we can right click and make a new layout file. This can be called our just fragment test for our test fragment. And for now, we'll just go ahead and add a text view in the center. So text view, we'll do wrap content, wrap content. We'll set the text with a tools text. So we won't actually hard code any text. We'll do that programmatically. We'll just have some preview text saying this is the test fragment, exclamation mark. And we'll center this in the layout. So what we'll do is we'll just do opposing constraints on all sides. Actually, no, easier than that. We'll just do match content to make it fill the space. So match content, and then we can set the gravity, not the layout gravity, but the gravity to center. And that's a text view that fills the whole space, but the text itself is centered. It's probably the quickest way to center it in the container. And we'll give the text view just a simple ID saying fragment text. So now we have a layout. We can go back to activity_main, and we can fix the warning with tools, and then layout. So now we have a layout. We can go back to activity_main, the simple ID saying fragment text. So now we have a layout. We can go back to activity_main, and we can fix the warning with tools, and then layout. And what this will do is it will tell the design preview to the right what layout file we're using just for the preview. Give that a moment, and then you can see if we zoom in, we have the blue border that shows the fragment container view there, and then inside this design preview on the right, we're using the layout file for our new fragment there. So yes, if you make a fragment container view in modern versions of Android Studio and you don't give it a layout to render, then it's likely your design preview on the right isn't going to work. So hopefully that will clear up any confusion for you. You need to put a tools layout to tell the design preview what fragments to show in your fragment container view. Okay, so that looks okay. So we have this as a test fragment. I actually now want to put a couple of buttons underneath this. So I think I'll change the height to be 300 dp, make it a bit shorter to give myself some more space. I'll do an auto format to bring the ID to the top. And then I'll do a button underneath this. So button, make it a bit shorter to give myself some test view there, just for the previews. And then layout, is centered. It's probably the quickest way to center it in the container. And we'll give the text view just a simple ID saying fragment text. So now we have a layout. We can go back to activity_main, and we can fix the warning with tools, and then layout. And what this will do is it will tell the design preview to the right what layout file we're using just for the preview. Give that a moment, and then you can see if we zoom in, we have the blue border that shows the fragment container view there, and then inside this design preview on the right, we're using the layout file for our new fragment there. So yes, if you make a fragment container view in modern versions of Android Studio and you don't give it a layout to render, then it's likely your design preview on the right isn't going to work. So hopefully that'll clear up any confusion for you. You need to put a tools layout to tell the design preview what fragments to show in your fragment container view. Okay, so that looks okay. So we have this as a test fragment. I actually now want to put a couple of buttons underneath this. So I think I'll change the height to be 300 dp, make it a bit shorter to give myself some more space. That's an auto format to bring the ID to the top. And then I'll do a button underneath this. So button, do wrap content, and we'll do top to the bottom of the fragment container to make it underneath. And the text can say show fragment. And I think I want that centered, so I'll do start to start of parent and end to the end of parent to center that. And I'll copy all of this to another button underneath it. So copy the whole thing. Now I'll give them both IDs. So this is the button show fragment, and this can be the button remove fragment. So we'll make this playground app have the ability to add a fragment to remove the fragment, so we can look at those lifecycle methods in action, see them happening. So we'll make the remove button underneath the show fragment button, and we'll just change the text to say remove fragment. So I've rushed my way through that, but the important thing we have now is a fragment container with an ID that we can reference, so we can add a fragment to this container in our main activity. So we have that, and then underneath our fragment container, we have two buttons, one that will show the fragment and one that will remove the fragment. So we can now close down these layout files, both of them, and we can head back to main activity. And under the existing button click listeners, we will add a couple of more listeners for the new buttons. So we will do binding.button show fragment, and we'll do set on click listener. Leave it empty for now. I'll duplicate that, Command D, Control D. I'll do another one for button remove fragment, and I'll just type a couple of methods that don't exist yet. So this can be show fragment, this can be remove fragment. Then I'll use the arrow by doing Option Enter, Alt Enter, create function, and then same again. And I'll put them in the correct order. I'm a little bit OCD with things like that. So we now have the space to do our show fragment code and our remove fragment code. We're going to actually need a fragment class, so we'll quickly go ahead and do that. So to the left, where main activity is, in the containing package, right-click, new Kotlin class file, and we'll call this our test fragment. Make sure it's a class, and this can extend our fragment class. This is all recap from the previous fragment section, but it's been quite a few tutorials since we first done this, so some of this might extend. Right-click, same again, and I'll put them in the correct order. I'm a little bit OCD with things like that. So we now have the space to do our show fragment code and our remove fragment code. We're going to actually need a fragment class, so we'll quickly go ahead and do that. So to the left, where main activity is, in the containing package, right-click, new Kotlin class file, and we'll call this our test fragment. Make sure it's a class, and this can extend our fragment class. This is all recap from the previous fragment section, but it's been quite a few tutorials since we first done this, so some of this might be forgotten, so this is a good recap. And we'll go ahead now and put in the two lifecycle methods that I highlighted from that diagram in the previous video. And that was one for onCreateView, so onCreateView autocomplete, and then a few line breaks, and then the other one was on view created. Okay, we'll leave on attach and on detach for now, and we're going to use view binding just like we did in our record keeper app for the view. So I'm going to make a late init variable, so private late init var. This can just be our binding. And it's of type fragment test binding, matching our fragment underscore test layout file. And then in the onCreateView method, we can do fragment test binding dot inflate, and we can pass in the layout inflator that we have access to in onCreateView that's given to us. We will inflate it into the same container, which will actually be that fragment container view that we put in the main activities layout. And remember, always attach the parent false. We don't want to attach the fragment to that container. We actually want to attach it to the activity. We will need to assign that to our binding variable, so binding equals that line there. So now we have the binding inflated, we can simply return the root view of that binding, so binding.root, which is actually the top layout in the fragment test layout, the constraint layout. You can see there when I type root, it correctly recognizes it's a constraint layout. So we just return the parent view in our layout file, binding.root, and Android Studio is smart enough to know that this is non-nullable, it won't be null. We can say we will definitely return a non-null view. Good. Now, if you recall, in our fragment test layout, I use tools text, so actually no text would show in this code. So we will go ahead and good. Now, if you recall, in our fragment test layout, it won't be null. We can say, so we just return the parent view in our layout file, binding.root, and Android Studio is smart enough to know that this is non-nullable, it won't be null. we can say we will definitely return a non-null view. Good. Now, if you recall, in our fragment test layout, I used tools text. So actually no text would show in this code. So we will go ahead now in the onViewCreated method, not an onCreateView, and start to update some of our views. I did mention this in the previous tutorial. I showed in the Android documentation how it is recommended to not do anything with your views until you have made it to the onViewCreated method. So here it is safe to start updating and interacting with your views. So text view fragment text.text equals, and we'll just say we have made it into our new fragment. This is the onViewCreated code. Okay, so that will show us that our onViewCreated code is working. So the final thing we need to do is decode to actually show this fragment when they click the Show Fragment button. So back in main activity, in Show Fragment, it's been a few tutorials now, but the thing we need to access to add a new fragment is the Support Fragment Manager. Okay, now there was a useful little method called .commit, but we don't have access to that because we have to add a specific dependency to have this convenience method. You can add a fragment without the .commit helper function in Kotlin, but it's so much easier if we use this commit method. So we'll go ahead quickly and add that library. So in the build.gradle in our app folder here, we will scroll down, and under the implementation lines, we'll make a few new line breaks. I'll use Command D to duplicate the last line, and it's actually the fragment KTX dependency that we need to add. I'll head over to Google to find the correct version as of today. So Android fragment-KTX. I can see it here. So this is all of the KTX, the Kotlin extension functions. And if I go on the right-hand side, I can see fragment KTX. That's the one we need for our useful fragment transaction method, the .commit method. And I can see it's version 1.5.5 that I need. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this whole line, Android X fragment-KTX, version 1.5.5, back to Android Studio. And actually, I can just delete that duplicated line and just paste that in there. So that will give us access to that useful .commit method that makes adding fragments so much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and click sync now to update Now I type .commit, I see I have access to autocomplete that useful commit message, which makes adding fragments in what's called a fragment transaction makes it a lot easier. So inside this block, I can see that it is actually a fragment transaction. And now we're inside this fragment transaction block. We have access to lots of methods, all the different things you can do with a fragment transaction. And one of the core things you can do with a fragment transaction is add a new fragment. So we'll do add ADD, and we can see we have lots of different versions of the add method. One that takes a fragment and a tag, one that takes a container view ID, and it is actually the one with the container view ID that we need. We need to give the container we want to put the fragment into, and then our new fragment. So the second one down, add, and you can see that in the prompt, it's the fourth one down, the ID of our fragment container, and then the fragment itself. So we'll go ahead and do r.id, and it's the fragment container, and then the second argument will be a new instance of our fragment. And we can just go ahead and do test fragment with the curly brackets to make a new object. And that is pretty much all the code that we need to add a new fragment into that container whenever the user clicks the Show Fragment button. And then if I go ahead and click the Run button, we can see now we have our two new buttons, Show and Remove Fragment, as well as this space under the Exit Activity button where our fragment container is. But we can put into that container whenever the user clicks the Show Fragment button. And then if I go ahead and click the Run button, we can see now we have our two new buttons, Show and Remove Fragment, as well as this space under the Exit Activity button where our fragment container is. But of course right now there's nothing inside this fragment container because we haven't added a fragment to it. And if I go ahead now and click the Show Fragment button, you can see we have made it into our new fragment. This is the onViewCreated code. Okay, so quite a lot of setup to introduce fragments into this Activity Lifecycle playground. We added the fragment container view to our main activity. We created a new fragment and a new fragment layout. We had to add the fragment KTX library so the .commit method would work. You can see there. And then we had to add into the fragment container ID a new test fragment. But now we've done all of that setup, we're in a fantastic position to start looking at these fragment lifecycle methods. So let's do that next.